Back at our dig near Bristol, our crashed Heinkel is proof of how effective our defences could be. But there is still no sign of that second engine.
We'll find evidence where the other engine was, even if the other engine isn't here. So we'll keep our fingers crossed that it is here.
We're down about 15 feet now. Yep. And if we're lucky, there might still be something there, but we're down an awful long way, so...
What's your hunch?
I think another 5 feet and we'll hit the other engine.
The digger bucket is almost at the limit of its reach when, a few feet further down, we hit another seam of wreckage from the plane. The one thing that struck me about this whole excavation, Steve, is the minutiae that survived, particularly some of the nameplates. You've got a couple there.
Yeah, I have. Yeah, this one actually has got a little bit of an address on the bottom of Berlin.
Fantastic piece of intelligence,
really,
isn't
actually,
it?
Yeah, it is.
But of all the nameplates and writing we have found on the bomber, one has really struck me. That's extraordinary. Bosch.
Yeah.
I've got a power drill at home with exactly the same logo.
It is, yeah. I mean, they were going before the war, during and after. And something like that obviously is recognisable, even if you don't know the relevance to the aeroplane. As you say, you recognise it instantly.
After 5 hours, the team have amassed an impressive haul of over 3 tons of wreckage. The best pieces will be cleaned for display in a local museum. What's that down there?
Oh, there we go.
Kind of reassuring crunch here would be. That sounds quite interesting, doesn't it? Yeah. The teeth of the bucket definitely bit on that.
Yeah, there's something pretty substantial down there, so...
Yeah. It's the prize Gareth and the team have been hoping for. From 30 feet down, the digger bucket drags up the find of the day. Entombed in mud for 70 years is the complete engine of a German bomber. This was the beating heart of the Heinkel bomber, which was sent to spread terror and destruction in Bristol during the dark days of the Blitz. Well, this has to be the biggest find of the day, Steve. Are you pleased with how it's gone?
I think we're very pleased, Jules, yeah. I mean, obviously, it's by far the biggest, the most impressive lump we found today. Yeah. The second engine, much, much deeper than the first one. Obviously, the first one over here in pieces, which is very shattered.
Well, you can certainly see what's happened to it, just ripped to pieces. That was the first one we found. We weren't sure if we'd get to the second one,
weren't.
But there it is.
So we found one of the exhaust stacks here. If you get that end, you can just give it a little bit of a...
Oh, I see, right. So this would stick out of the engine cover, as it were?
Yeah, this would stick out of the cowlings, but it's sort of quite poignant in a way, because in Cruise Combat Report, he does state he saw the aeroplane initially by the glow of the exhaust. So he would have actually seen the red glow coming out of these exhausts.
So these are what gave it away?
These are, potentially, yeah, the very bit that sort of ended up in the aircraft's downfall.
This Heinkel was shot down before it could release its deadly cargo. But during the Blitz on Britain, thousands of bombers did get through. The horrific experiences of the people of London and Coventry have been well documented, but there are other places which have been largely overlooked. This is Hull, and I'm here because after London, it was the most devastated city in Britain. A staggering 93% of homes here were damaged or destroyed by the German bombing. At the outbreak of the war here in Hull, a local girl, Alice Hodgson, joined up as an air raid warden, and she kept a record of every raid that passed over the city. And throughout the entire duration of the war, she recorded 824 moments when the air raid sirens would have sounded over the city. Now, of course, not every air raid warning resulted in bombs falling on Hull itself, but many did, of course. Throughout the entire war, 1,200 people were killed and over 3,000 wounded. 1940 fills pages of this. Day after day, sometimes up to 4 or 5 raids during 24 hours. Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. And as it goes on, it begins to reflect the terminology of the time, the thing that everybody knew only too well. A simple entry, the time of the raid, its duration, and one word in the left-hand column: Blitz. Hull was a prime target because of its docks. But the real tragedy is that many of the bombs fell on the houses of ordinary families, leaving nearly 200,000 people homeless and desperate. For many, the only protection from the bombs were Anderson shelters, hastily constructed from sheets of metal and covered in earth or concrete. I've come to see one of the few surviving Anderson shelters left in Hull. John! I'm Jules, very nice to see you. Oh, I see. John Langley's father-in-law, Ron Porter, has got one in his back garden. Oh, look at that.
There we are.
Good God.
The original corrugated steel interior.
Yeah.
It is a very solid job.
Ron simply never got around to having it demolished.
I wouldn't think you could get 6 people sleeping in there every night, would you?
But you would remember that?
I remember it very well. Very often, when we were not expecting a raid, we would go to our normal bed and be in our bedrooms.
Was that something of a luxury?
I would guess it was at the time, yes. Because when the sirens went, Mother and Father would come up and collect myself as a younger one. I had an older brother. And we'd be carried down into the shelter with our pyjamas on and our dressing gown on and just plonked on our bench.
Now, can you give me a sense of what it was like spending a night in here? Because you spent, well, 2.5 years worth of nights in one of these, didn't you?
Roughly 2.5 years, yes. When planes came over, we knew there were bombers.
Yeah.
The Germans had a different, distinct tone.
Yeah.
And it was amazing that we all knew this. We'd see the searchlights. Yeah. They would be looking for the planes. And when the siren went to say it was an all clear, we were all delighted. But we would stop in the shelter till the following morning. Wouldn't get up and go back to our beds.
How did you feel when you'd go into the city centre and see it ever more destroyed?
Terrible. Hull was really badly damaged. And for many years, and I'm going to the 60s and 70s, there was lots of damage still in Hull then that had never been repaired.
This is Beverley Road in Hull. It's one of the main thoroughfares in and out of the city, and it has been for decades. Every day, thousands of people use it to get to work, but I bet very few of them know what's behind this hoarding. It's only by going round the back that you fully appreciate what's here. This shell of a building is all that remains of the National Picture Theatre, a cinema destroyed in the Hull Blitz. Wow, I wasn't expecting this. The heart of the cinema has clearly been ripped out by an explosion. This presumably is where the stage and the screen was, and then in here, the heart of it. This is where you came to catch up on the war. The great movie tone and Pathé newsreels bringing in stories from around the world, trying to inspire the population to keep going. 150 people were in the cinema at the time it was hit. It was a miracle that no one was killed. Shrapnel marks in the brickwork. Oh, and look at that. Look at those windows. Shattered glass splintered at the split second when the bomb went off. This building is one of the very few, if not the only, civilian building that survives, still damaged, from the Blitz. When you think of all the tens of thousands of other buildings that were destroyed up and down the country, not just here in Hull, but of course in Coventry and Birmingham, the great port cities of Southampton and of course Portsmouth itself, this is the only one that survives. All the rest of it's been fixed. But this little cinema. However, it's the human stories from the Hull Blitz which really interest me. The oldest person killed here was an 88-year-old woman. The youngest was a baby, just 3 weeks old. I've come to meet someone who experienced the full horror of the Hull bombing. 93-year-old Rita Greendale, who was just 25 at the time, was in her Anderson shelter with her young daughter Janet, as well as her rather frightened neighbour, Mrs. Bell.
She used to come and say, could she come in our shelter, because her husband was a policeman, and when the sirens went, he had to go on duty. She wouldn't rest. She was forever moaning about, she hoped Janet wouldn't wake up, she hoped the bombs wouldn't drop. And she was sure we were going to be killed, and oh, she really was dreadful. She went on and on and on. And she said, I'm sure we're going to be killed. Tell Ben I died with a smile on my lips. And with that, down came this awful noise, like a whirring noise. And that was it. The bomb had dropped on my house.
The force of the blast threw Rita, her daughter Janet, Mrs. Bell, and the shelter they were in 30 feet through the air into the next door garden, and they were now under a pile of rubble.
And I couldn't breathe. Everything was black, and I could hear voices, but I couldn't see anybody, I couldn't see anything. I'm clinging on to Janet and trying to move this blanket thing away from her face. The air raid wardens came and scrambled about, and we were dug out. And Mrs. Bell was dead. And it haunted me. And all I could think about was how awful I'd been, how nasty I'd been, telling her to shut up.
Mrs. Bell was one of over 40,000 civilians killed in the Blitz on Britain. And Hull was just one among many towns and cities that bravely faced the terror of the German raids. In the dark days of 1940, our island had stood alone. We had escaped catastrophe at Dunkirk. And in the skies above, the heroics of the RAF had prevented a German invasion and allowed Britain to fight on. We had survived the most perilous year in our nation's history.
Desperate times call for desperate measures later, set during the Great Depression. Catherine Cookson's The Man Who Cried is at 2 on Yesterday. Next, an Emmy-winning adaptation of a Jane Austen classic, WWII, is Emma.